Ancient gods, cosmic war, the Watchers? What if history wasn't just about kings and empires, but an unseen battle between divine beings? My guest today has spent years uncovering the supernatural threads woven through the Bible, and he's here to blow your mind. Brian Godawa, award-winning screenwriter, best-selling author, and biblical researcher, joins me to talk about Chronicles of the Watchers and Chronicles of the Nephilim and the hidden spiritual war playing out across history. From Genesis 6 to the giants of Canaan, from Noah's world to the battlefields of the Maccabees, this is the kind of discussion you won't hear in Sunday school. So buckle up, because this is the Ryan Files.
Chronicles of the Watchers is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, charting the influence of spiritual warfare on human history, a war of gods and men. Jezebel, harlot queen of Israel, Moses against the gods of Egypt, and other supernatural historical novels in the series Chronicles of the Watchers. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Watchers by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome this week to the Ryan Files. Man, from ancient gods, the Watchers, this cosmic war. We are so excited to have our guest on today, Brian Godawa. He is a award-winning screenwriter, best-selling author, biblical researcher. You've written the Chronicles of the Nephilim, Chronicles of the Watchers, Chronicles of the Apocalypse. You've got it all, man. I'm ready to go deep. How you doing, buddy? Thanks for coming on.
Good. Thanks for having me, Ryan. I love to talk about this stuff.
Awesome, man. Well, we're going to get into it. I was doing some research, came across your name, and I was like, well, this sounds like the perfect person to talk to, not only from the standpoint of the Nephilim, the Watchers. These things are interesting to me. I want to learn more about it, giants. But also, I am a huge fan of fiction, and I love the fact that you've taken some of these concepts and you've written entertaining books about it. And then I come to find out your experience as a screenwriter, Hollywood, all that stuff. So you're just the perfect guest for the Ryan Files. Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
You bet.
So let's get started, man. You're an author of all these books that kind of start with something that's kind of controversial. Some people feel that it is. Some people are right in with it. Talk a little bit about how all this started out with the giants, the Watchers, the Nephilim, all that. Genesis 6, basically stuff.
Yeah, Genesis 6. Well, of course, nowadays I think that the Book of Enoch and the Nephilim, Genesis 6, the Watchers, the giants, all that stuff is a big package. And it's obviously, I think it's very popular right now, and there's lots of people talking about it. I think there's a lot of nuts out there. I think there's a lot of goofy things going on with it, as with anything that becomes popular. All right. So when I first started it, like over 15 years ago, I started my research on it. I was actually, it was not quite known out there. And I was writing screenplays in Hollywood, and I was trying to come up with a cool idea that I thought would meld both Hollywood blockbuster type movies together with a biblical story that I would think both non-Christians and Christians would like. And so I settled upon the story of Noah because I started discovering all this bizarre information related to Genesis 6 that I thought was really interesting and could have a lot of interesting cinematic possibilities to it. So I actually wrote the script and started, going around Hollywood. And then I discovered Darren Aronofsky was already in the process of trying to get his Noah movie made. And so I realized, okay, I'm not going to have the chance to get that made because I'm a little guy, But I thought, okay, how can I get my story out? And I realized I have to adapt it into a novel. So I went ahead and took a year and I adapted that first screenplay into a novel back in 2011 or something like that. And I released it as a novel called Noah Primeval. And what it was my personal, as a Christian, I believe the Bible's God's word. And but I also believe that the Bible has genres in it. And I don't think the hyperliteralism is biblical at all, where Jesus take everything literally because I believe the Bible and I take it all literally. Well, it's not intended to be taken literally. So if you take it literally in every case, it's not intended to be taken literally in every place, right? And so if you do that, then you're actually being unbiblical and humanistic, actually. And so, this was Genesis 6 was one of those passages that had always confused me in the Bible. It was really strange. It looked like mythology because, I was familiar with the Greek myths of the Titans and such. And it kind of struck me as odd, but I just thought, what, maybe someday I'll understand it. But I just kept going, kept going in my Bible study and all that kind of stuff. And eventually, when I started looking into it, I stumbled upon Michael Heiser's writings. Now, this was before he was famous, and he actually had the book that would become The Unseen Realm. He had that online as he was writing it for free, and it was called The Myth That Is True. And I and some other of us guys stumbled upon this at the same time, and now we know each other. Doug Van Dorn, Derek Gilbert, Judd Burton, and some other guys. And so. Studying Genesis 6, 1 through 4, when it talks about the sons of God come down from heaven, mate with the daughters of men, they bore them giants called Nephilim, right? Just weird and bizarre stuff. But, the ancient world, there's a lot of mysterious things about the ancient world. And, if we know anything about history and science and such, reality is weird, and it often is weird, and we don't understand it. And so I'm not afraid to explore the possibilities of what was in the ancient world as being possibly a different world than the way we understand it to be. And as I studied in the Bible, I came to realize that this notion of these angels coming down from heaven, mating with humans, yeah, it's reflected in other mythologies, but there's a reason for that. And that is, if there was a real event or a real situation that did occur, it would make sense that as the world grew and people spread across the planet, they would carry with them the residual knowledge of those facts, and they would spin their own yarns to their own religious tales. So everyone has their own different version of it, just like the flood, right? There are flood myths everywhere. Well, why do you think that is? It's because there's something real behind it that then everybody does their own version of it, right? And so to me, that doesn't say, oh, therefore all religions just evolve out of one another and they borrow from one another. Well, they do borrow to some degree, but that doesn't mean it's not true, right? Just like historians borrow from other historians as they're doing their research, right? So this interesting notion of angels mating with humans, it's not just this bizarre mythological fantasy thing. It actually has a theological rootedness in the Bible, and there's many different aspects to it. And I discovered that it ultimately goes throughout the whole Bible. So in other words, there aren't just giants in that one passage, and Goliath isn't the only other giant that the Bible speaks of. There's actually many giants. The problem is that they're referred to by names like Anakim, Rephaim, and a lot of times people don't study it to know or to realize that those words are names of giant tribes, right?
Right.
And so as I did that study, I found this theological thread that I thought was so fascinating that I, as a storyteller, felt like I have to tell these stories. There's a lot more to tell here. And I wanted to sort of retell Bible stories that would reflect this theological thread. I call it the war of the seed. The Genesis 3:15, where God says, he curses the serpent. He says, your seed will be at enmity or at war with the seed of the woman. Seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. And that, of course, is the perennial pursuit of Satan's people to try to stop the bloodline of Messiah in the Old Testament and to fight against God's people. And what does that look like? And how does that manifest itself? Well, that was the journey that blew my mind. And so I started writing more novels as part of the series after Noah Primeval. I went and wrote a prequel called Enoch Primordial. And that's, of course, Enoch's story takes place before Noah's. And then I went on from there to Abraham and other stories, David and ultimately Jesus. And then I realized that there were stories that I didn't tell through the first series, Chronicles of the Nephilim, and I realized I needed to fill that out. So I wrote Chronicles of the Watchers, and I'm working on novels right now in that series, which is sort of filling out other stories I missed, like the story of Moses, right, and the story of the Maccabees, which we'll talk about. That's my latest release, but. And then ultimately, I have a series called Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and that is the origin story of the Book of Revelation. A lot of people nowadays, when you read novels about or the Book of Revelation, it's always about what happens at the end. Well, my goal is I want to tell the story of how it all began in the first century when John was writing the Book of Revelation and the supernatural context of that. So all these series are kind of interlinked and interwoven with the same concept, and that concept, rooted in Genesis 6 and expanded in other passages, is this notion of the spiritual world being a real world that is not just like angels and demons floating around generically, sort of whatever, angel of or demon of lust and demon of pride, not like that, but actual real beings. And there's a war going on, a spiritual war, and it's not just a generic, again, the spiritual war of today, which is demons are battling us and such, but there's actually a high level going on, and that is rooted in Genesis 6, but also another passage. There's a lot of passages, but there are key passages that that you begin with that help develop the idea and the understanding. The other key passage that Michael Heiser wrote about was Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 through 10. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance. What's that? Well, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. The idea there is talking about Babel, and most scholars will tell you that's what it's about. And why? Because that's when he divided the tongues, right? And so Babel, it also says that God gave the nations their inheritance, and then he fixes them according to the number of the sons of God. Now, who are these sons of God? Well, we heard about them in Genesis 6, right? They were supernatural beings from heaven who came down to earth. Those were rebels in particular. They defied God's holy separation between heaven and earth, in terms of the mating with human women and such. You have to understand there's, holiness or separation is a very common theme throughout the whole Bible and the Old Testament. And in Genesis, in fact, creation is defined as separation, isn't it? Separating the land from the seas, separating the woman from man. All these separations, it's the essence of creation. And so also there's a separation between heaven and earth. And like Jude talks about those angels that came down, they call them angels in Jude, but sons of God particularly, it's a very technical term that you study throughout the Old Testament. You'll see that it's a term that defines spiritual divine beings who surround God's heavenly host or surround God's throne. And they're also called the heavenly host. They're also called B'nai Ha-Elohim, sons of God. They're also called holy ones. So they have various names, but they're the same beings. And the idea here is that in Deuteronomy 32, the idea is that God is, when he split the languages at Babel, he creates the nations, right? He divides mankind and he fixes the borders. That's a reference to the nations, the national borders. That's when the nations were created. Now you read about those nations. What were those nations? There were 70 of them in Genesis 10. And so that's where you find out where those nations originally came from. And what does this mean? He gives the nations their inheritance and he numbers them according to these sons of God. Well, the idea here is that, and Daniel talks about this, where there are watchers, the term we call watchers, who are over nations, peoples, earthly authorities. The biblical view and the ancient view is that over every earthly authority, whether it's a city or a nation or sometimes even a king, there are spiritual authorities in the heavens, and they are connected. They are connected to them. Why? Because it's sort of like saying, God is saying here, look, you, after Babel, you guys just continue to worship false gods. So I'm going to give you over to them, and you're going to become slaves to those gods that you worship, and you're going to be under their authority. And they are these sons of God, these divine beings. And so God says, but my people will be Jacob. So God will be over his people, Jacob, and their land will be Israel. Every other nation has their land, and they have their gods or their inherited or allotted authorities over them. So this is why throughout the Bible you hear about things like, there's a spiritual warfare going on while there's an earthly warfare going on. And, remember when Elisha's servant, was worried that Jerusalem was surrounded by the pagan armies. And he's like, oh, we're going to be destroyed. And then Elisha prays to have his eyes opened, and he sees in the heavens, he sees a heavenly army. More are with us than with them. So this is this linkage that's going on in the Bible. In Daniel 10, we read about the Prince of Persia versus the Prince of Greece. They're battling just in the same way that the historical nations of Persia and Greece were battling in those days, right? So this is this ancient notion that is very biblical, but it's very alien to our modern mindset. And I thought, what if, well, to go down a little further in Deuteronomy 32, let me just wrap up this notion is Moses is talking about when the people of Israel are coming into the promised land, but then he says that they're going to worship the false gods. They're going to turn away from Yahweh and worship these gods of Canaan. Here's what he says, verse 17. Israel sacrificed to demons that were not God, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. So there's a biblical notion that there, behind these gods of the nations that are worshipped, there is a spiritual reality, a demonic reality. So I kind of thought, well, what if the gods of the ancient world, Zeus in Greece or Baal and Ashtart in Canaan, right? What if these gods had actual demonic reality behind them, and that those beings were those sons of God that were rebels from God, that were authorities over the Gentile nations? What if those were all the same kind of thing? And so, in other words, these mythologies are based on, based on some demonic reality. They're worshiping these gods, but they're actually demons behind them. This was a speculative imagination that fits with the text, I think, but it was the basis for how I wanted to write my novels. So what I have as Israel is interacting with the various nations in their biblical stories, I also bring out the supernatural side of things behind the curtain. What might it look like? Speculative, admittedly, but what might it look like with these watchers or these spiritual authorities over the nations? Well, they would have their own plans and such, right? And they're linked to what's going on earth. So I said, what would that story look like? And Chronicles of the Nephilim and Watchers and Apocalypse was my attempt to sort of pull back that curtain and show, here's what it might look like. Admittedly, it's creative imagination, it's speculation, but it's a way of making sense of the theology in the text, because the Bible doesn't say a lot about it. It references this theology a lot, the theology of what we might call the divine council or the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. There's a lot of references to it, but there's not a lot explained. And then the other component was the giants, right? Like, what's the point of the giants? Is it just like, oh, half human, half angel? Makes sense. They're going to be gigantic, monsters of some kind, right? Does that mean they're 30 foot tall? No, I don't think that's what it means at all. Goliath was at most 9 feet and 9.5 feet, but there is textual evidence that he may have been 6'6", which is still a large being. So the word giant is a bad word for us because we tend to think of Jack and the Beanstalk, that kind of giant 30-foot tall type of thing. But I think it just simply means tall, very tall men. Now, when you're 5'5" average height in the ancient world in Israel, 6'5" is even, that's a giant, right? And then you would have tribes of these people. So there's something definitely different going on there. And it's connected back to that disobedience before the flood. And so, but the interesting thing about that is it's not just an anomaly that pops up like, oh, well, that's what you get when you have angels and humans mating. Because what happens is when they get to the promised land and the spies go in there, what you get is giants in the land. Remember when the spies come back and they
Like grasshoppers.
yeah, they brought back the report in Numbers 13:32. They brought back a bad report of the land, saying, "The land which we have gone to spy out devours its inhabitants." That's metaphorical, but that points to something. "All the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim." Those are the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed like grasshoppers. So there's this, what's going on here? Well, there are giants in the land, literally, right? And those are the ones that Joshua's ending up having to wipe out, the Anakim. And the Anakim come from the Nephilim. What's going on there? The writer is linking those giants in Canaan to the giants before the flood, who were these evil progeny, right? And so the Nephilim come into play as they're wiping out the promised land. Then you've got Og of Bashan. He was the last of the Rephaim, and Rephaim were giants. So, and then by the time you get to David, well, David, sure, he took down Goliath, but did you know that actually there were 5 giants who were hunting David? So if you read 1 Samuel and 1 Samuel 17, 1 Chronicles 20, 2 Samuel 21, you read about various giants. They call them descendants of the giants. That's not the best of translations of the Hebrew phrase, but I'll take it for now. And they describe these various giants who went after King David. They were trying to kill him. And I ended up writing, who are those giants? 5 of them? And what? They're showing up in the Bible? I didn't catch that before. Well, they were, and they were deliberately hunting him. So I wrote a novel called David Ascendant. It's the one story about David that you'll never read anywhere else, because I told the story about those 5 giants hunting him and why they were. And it is connected to Goliath. It's connected to a warrior cult trying to wipe out the messianic seed. And so this is just a taste of the kind of theological elements that you can see. Once I saw this in the text, I thought, wow, these stories need to be told. And so my goal is to retell Bible stories, make them consistent with the Bible, because I believe in the Bible, but fill in the gaps because the Bible doesn't tell everything, right? It tells high points, and then there's large gaps that we don't know. And so I fill in those gaps with fiction, and I have some fictional characters. And my goal is to try to make sense of what we do know with what we might not know fully, or what we might speculate on. And that was the premise of my series. And to be honest, when I first started, like, what is it now, 15 years ago, I really thought Christians would not like it. I had to write it because it was fascinating to me, and I believed it, and I'm like, I don't care. I believe this, and so I'm gonna write this stuff. And like I said, admittedly, I do add some imagination in there, and I push the envelope. So, you have to know this is supernatural fiction and such, but the principle is still true of what I'm writing. And I thought Christians wouldn't like it because they would think, oh, you're playing with the word of God, and there are some who do attack me for that, but very, very few. I've been amazed to see how many people really get what I'm doing and love the series, and has opened their eyes with a fresh view of reading the scriptures. Even in many Christians saying that it's reinvigorated their interest in the scriptures. They're seeing it with new, fresh eyes, not as anything different, but just as more full than what they realized,
Amen.
And so that's the kind of story behind the series.
It's so funny. I had an author on named Mark Goodwin, and he made a quote, and I think it's the exact same thing with regards to what you're doing. Don't get your eschatology from fiction, Yeah. And that's kind of the point is, yeah, you obviously got to take if you're writing fiction, you're going to take some guesses, thoughts, liberties, whatever. But I'm sure that just as so many things are, it's in line with scripture. You're just filling in spots here and there for a entertainment value, fictitious, piece of writing. It's not like you're saying this is holy scripture or anything, right?
Right. And one of the things I did was, in light of that, because I take the Bible seriously and I knew Christians would, I wanted to offer them um, an insight into the research that I did. So what I did was, and by the way, I was inspired by Michael Crichton. Michael Crichton would write his wild sci-fi novel, and then he would give an appendix at the back, telling a little bit about the real world research that he based on. Well, I did the same thing. So in Chronicles of Nephilim, I put an appendix at the end of each novel where I explained some of the research, where I got some of the ideas from, so people could realize, oh, this isn't all just made up. What I do is I also draw from ancient Jewish legends and Christian legends. Again, admittedly, they're legends, but they are in our history of tradition. Our traditions, our history, right? And so I incorporate a lot of those. I didn't make up as much as people might think I did, right? So I provide that research, and now in so much, I started writing so many pages of research that nowadays what I do is I will release the novel, and at the same time, I will release a separate book about the research behind the novel. And many of my readers actually love reading that research book first, because then they get the biblical and historical context. So when they read the fiction, it makes more sense to them, and they're more familiar with it, and it's very fascinating. So that's kind of what I do now, and that's what I've done with my latest release, which is Judah Maccabee.
Yeah, let's talk about that, man, because there's so much that you've done as far as starting from Noah through Jesus Christ. But then you said filling in the gaps and whatnot. But this one, the one that's coming out, Judah Maccabee, obviously it's connected in some way to the idea of Hanukkah.
Yeah, it is the story of Hanukkah. Yeah,
exactly. But, I didn't realize what Maccabee meant. And it's just very interesting. Tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, sure. Well, Judah Maccabee, the story of Judah Maccabee is in the Apocrypha, which is books that are not considered canon by Protestants, but are considered canon by Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. Now, there's variations on that, but roughly speaking, they believe that these apocryphal books, such as First and Second Maccabees, Judith, Tobit. There are several of these books like that are that's in the Apocrypha, and which also has a history that goes back to the beginning of the church. And what I found interesting was, so this is a story based out of the book of Maccabees, First and Second and Fourth Maccabees, which they are in some versions of the Apocrypha. And why did I do that story? Well, there's several reasons, but first of all, one is I did some research on the Apocrypha and thought, well, what is the basis of that, and why did we not accept it in the canon? And I think there's a very good, legitimate reasons why it was not received into the canon, but through the entire history of the church, including the Reformation, that all the scholarly godly men, most all of them gave high respect and high regard for the Apocrypha, even if it wasn't canon. So they would say, okay, it's not scripture, but it's helpful for spiritual instruction or historical references, etc. So the problem is that the Apocrypha is not false. A lot of times some Christians will hear Apocrypha, oh, that's false, and oh, you shouldn't read those books, No, there's no need to be afraid of them. They're just historical / legendary stories. And the Maccabees is a particularly historical story that is taken down in the books of the Maccabees, and that's in the Apocrypha. And so that story is the story that takes place in the 3rd century BC, where the Jews for a short period of time had actually revolted against the Greek kingdom that was over them, and the temple was polluted by an image of Zeus that was placed there by King Antiochus Epiphanes, and the Jews rose up in revolt and kicked the Greeks out and cleansed the temple and reinstituted it with holiness. And so it's historically for Jews, it's a very important time period, but also for Christians, because actually, that story in Maccabees ends up being the fulfillment of some of Daniel's prophecies. So Daniel is, if you read the book of Daniel, you'll see the overarching story in Daniel is he's saying, look, we're going into exile, we're going to be punished, and God is not happy with us as we continue to worship idols. Therefore, God is going to leave Israel under the oppression of Gentile nations until Messiah comes. And he delineates those as 4 major kingdoms that will be over Israel. First is the Babylonian kingdom, which is what Daniel was under. Then would come the Medo-Persians, then would come the Greek Empire, and then ultimately the Roman Empire, or the Greek kingdom, and then the Roman kingdom. And when you study Daniel, you start to see the whole point of Daniel is he's saying, look, all these Gentile nations will be oppressing Israel until Messiah comes. And then he has these visions, the vision of the statue that reinforces the 4 kingdoms. He has the vision of the monsters, the beasts coming out of the sea, and their various hybrid beasts. And they also represent the 4 kingdoms that will rule over Israel until Messiah comes. And then ultimately you get near the end of Daniel, Daniel chapter 11, and you read about this bizarre sort of series of prophecies that don't make sense if you're just reading it without knowledge. The king of the north will fight the king of the south. The king of the north's daughter will marry this daughter. And it's just back and forth. It's one of the most confusing prophecy passages I've ever read. But when you study it and find out, you discover that actually that Daniel 11 is describing the 6 Syrian wars that occurs during this 3rd century BC. And it includes the Maccabees, the story of the Maccabees, and Antiochus Epiphanes. Why? Why does he include it? Why is it so important? Because Antiochus Epiphanes did something very rare, which was he placed an image of Zeus in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem and tried to force Jews to give up their religion, eat pork, and sacrifice to Zeus. Well, they wouldn't have it, so they were martyred for it. Some of them did, but some of them were martyred. And then that's when you have the Maccabean revolt that rises up and kicks the king out. That's what my Judah Maccabee novels are all about. They're retelling that story. But what's interesting is Daniel 11 talks about those various wars, and Antiochus Epiphanes is important because he places the abomination of desolation in the temple. And there are 2 different abominations of desolation in Daniel. One is this Antiochus Epiphanes story, and then there's one that is in the future, and that's the one that Jesus refers to when he says the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. That's in his future. But there is one that was fulfilled in the past, and this Maccabee story is the fulfillment of that out of Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11. So that's got the connection to the Bible. But And so I retell the story of Judah Maccabee, but I also bring in that spiritual dimension that I've talked about, where I have the watchers over the nations and such. So it's always got that dual storyline going on, right?
Right.
But the other component that makes it very fascinating to me as a Christian is this is a time period, 3rd century BC, right? Well, I'm sorry, begins around, well, I guess I would say more like it's the 2nd century BC, because the events of Judah Maccabee begin in 169 BC. And that's when my story takes place, from 169 to 165 BC. But that time period included a couple hundred years. But it's smack dab in the middle of the 400 years of silence between the Old and New Testaments. Because you see, the last prophet that spoke in Israel, Malachi, was about 400 BC. And then there were no more prophets until who? Elijah, John the Baptist.
Yeah.
Just like he was promised. Malachi said, when Elijah comes, you'll have, the Lord will come. And so it's 400 years of silence where God is not talking to his people. Not only that, but when there is the Babylonian exile, Ezekiel sees the vision of the Spirit of God leaving the temple, which is supposed to be his house in the midst of his people. It leaves and he never returns. And that's why the prophets promise about one day Yahweh will return to Zion. And in that whole time, he's not returning. But when Jesus comes, that is Yahweh returning to Zion, right? N.T. Wright writes a lot about this, and he does a really fantastic job of that. So this period is God is silent. He's absent from his temple, his house. It's relation. Does this mean that God isn't really there? No, of course, God is omniscient and he's omnipotent. He's everywhere and all that, but omnipresent, right? But relationally, what I'm talking about is relationally, God is withdrawn from Israel. And that's the punishment. That's the silence for rejecting him. Then he says in Daniel chapter 9, he prophesies that Messiah will come and put an end to the sin of Israel, of rejecting him, right? Bring an end to sin, stop the sacrifice and such. And Messiah would bring that. And so that whole storyline of Daniel is working its way out during this Maccabees, right? And that occurs under the Greek kingdom. Because at the time of the Maccabees, the Greek Seleucid kingdom was ruling in that time, in that area and over the Levant, which included Israel. And interestingly, though, the Greek kingdom was split between north and south. In the north was the Seleucid kingdom in Syria. In the south was the Egyptian kingdom of the Ptolemies. They were both Greek rulers, and they'd been ruling for a long time, and they were having battles between each other, and Israel was in the middle of it. And that's why it's so important and an interesting, fascinating historical story. And, that's why I told it. And again, I think Christians are getting it. They don't have to, think that the book of Maccabees is scripture to be able to appreciate a very fascinating historical story.
Excellent. And I love the fact that you told me Maccabee is translated in Hebrew as hammer of God.
Yeah, hammer. And so the idea there was that he was the hammer of God, bringing justice, and cleansing idolatry from the land. Yeah. So yeah,
so much of this. When I say stuff, it's probably the wrong word, but so much of this stuff is like almost Hollywood. Like it feels like Lord of the Rings. It feels like Clash of the Titans. It feels like these stories in so many ways that are going on between Watchers, Giants, Nephilim, God, God's people, the nations, the princes and principalities of these
very
nations.
Complex. In some ways, it's very complex. And, that's why I love it, because these are all written as supernatural, epic, action romance type stories, right? I try to have romance in every story because I love romances, but they're very action oriented. My heroes are very masculine warrior heroes of the Bible. And so my background comes from Hollywood screenwriting, and I think that's what drew me to these novels, because it's like writing a big epic. In fact, Judah Maccabee, there's a lot of similarities between Judah Maccabee and Braveheart. And not that I like artificially tried to make it like Braveheart, but there's a lot of things that happen in the story that was kind of similar to Braveheart. And so I do follow the paradigm of Braveheart in many ways. So if you love those kind of movies, you'll actually love the novels.
Excellent. And when is this book going to, I know it's coming out soon, correct?
I just released it in December, so it's all out now, exclusively on Amazon, and in paperback, hardcover, and ebook. And the audiobooks will be available within a couple weeks from now.
That's awesome. I know I love reading, don't get me wrong, but doing what I do and being as busy as I am, a lot of times the audiobook is the way I go, just so I can kind of do two things at once.
Yeah, me too.
So audiobooks are great. That's awesome. What about a website, anything where people can get a hold of you?
Yeah, Godawa.com. That's my name, GODAWA.com. I have a lot of information on all the books I've written, and, free articles. And, I try to make it a very interesting, worthy website. But, if you just go to Amazon and type in my name and you get my author page, you'll see everything you need to learn about the series as well.
Speaking of your site, there's a picture of you. Is that like a Scottish claymore sword you're holding there?
Yeah, it is this claymore that is it's a relic, not a relic. What do they call it?
Replica.
Replica of the Braveheart sword that was used in Braveheart. And it's a real sword, though. It's a real sword. So I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's the house behind you there in that picture?
Oh, that's just some old place we found. My photographer found. We thought it would look cool. It's actually a church. So
is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, I am a sword collector myself, so trust me, I love swords. Love all of it. Yeah, Scottish claymores are.
Yeah.
Imagine
why you recognized it was the claymore. Yeah.
Imagine wielding one of those, on a battlefield. How tired you get. How quick.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I'll tell you what, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to have you back sometime so we can talk a little bit more about the writing side, the movie side, the Hollywood side, because you're connected with both of it. That would be amazing if I could get you to come back on.
Sure. Love to come back on, Ryan. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on this week, and man, God bless you, and we'll have you back on shortly, and thank you so much. Man, what an incredible conversation. Brian Godawa is taking biblical history and making it cinematic in words. And honestly, after today, I'll never look at Genesis 6 or the giants the same way again. If you got something out of this, don't forget to hit that like button, share this episode, and subscribe if you haven't already. Want to go deeper? Become a channel member right here on YouTube. You'll get access to custom emojis and even early access to new episodes. And if you really want to help out the Ryan Files grow, consider joining my Patreon at patreon.com/The Ryan Files and become an agent of the show. Every bit of support helps keeping these conversations going. You folks are awesome, be amazing, be positive, and stay curious out there, my friends. And I'll see you right here next week on The Ryan Files.
Are you not curious?
Preparing to transfer the Ryan Files. Now.
I present to you, with great intrigue and wonder, the Ryan Files.